Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I will have episode 9 of my reading of my confession, Recollections of a Rogue by Samuel Chamberlain. And you can listen to my other readings of this on my podcast that's History Books Read by William Ramsey. So I have all the books that I've read all in one spot. I'll put a link to it on my social media. You can check out some of the other things I've read. Bernal Diaz's Conquest of New Spain, amongst others. They're all historical documents about Gilles de Rais, the 16th century French occultist, among other things. So check those out, and thank you for listening. So again, we're starting off. This is episode 9 and going to chapter 32, guerrilla hunting. I was again reduced to the ranks for being absent without leave, and found on my return to camp that I had been reported as a deserter, for I'd been absent 5 days of desperate riding and hunting, with despair driving me almost to madness. My distress of mind was so great that the officers neither sent me to the guardhouse nor put me on duty. They all must have felt guilty in delivering her up to such a fearful death. I tried to drown my agony by drinking deeply, but I could not drive her dear image from my mind. I dwelled constantly on my great loss. In my sleep, I would see her struggling with the fiends and hear her calling to me to save her. Bitterly, I cursed myself for not shooting Vejo in the first place, but regrets were useless, and El Tuerto still lived. A chance came at last for revenge. Canales, El Zorro, the fox, became too troublesome for our line of communication. His depredations must be stopped. Hordes of Texan Rangers were let loose on the country, and though hundreds of his men were slain, El Zorro always succeeded in getting clear. This man-hunting, though exciting, was a very disagreeable duty and gained no honor. No quarter was given by either side, and in many a fierce conflict with the Salteadores, the total casualties were greater than in many battles fought during the war, yet no report of them was ever printed. A detachment of dragoons under Lieutenant Abe Buford was ordered to join this grand hunting expedition, and I was among the first to volunteer my services. With 4 days' rations and 100 rounds of carbine ammunition, we left our camp at Walnut Springs before daylight one morning in the month of October, 1847. Moving out on the Camargo Road, sunrise found us at the ruined ranch of San Fernando, where we encountered the alcalde of San Nicolas, completely disguised in a serape. I had not seen this alcalde, Don Pedro Galvez, since he vouched for the respectability of El Tuerto, and the sight of him aroused all my bad passions. I knew he was leagued with the guerrillas, and wishing to have a few words with him privately, I remained behind while the rest of the column rode on. I made a few inquiries about the health of his dear amigo El Tuerto. Then I rejoined the column, while carrion birds circled over the spot where we parted, and the cries of coyotes came clear as they drew together to breakfast on the remains of a miserable, treacherous alcalde. At daylight on the 3rd, we came in sight of a large house standing on the bank of a small stream. Manuel, our guide, said it was a Casa El Diablo, or Devil's House. Deploying as skirmishers, we surrounded the place at a gallop. It was quaintly built and ruinous structure of a small slate stones, rising in 4 stories like steps, the upper one being the smallest. Scrub oak, mesquite, and a variety of the cactus family grew out of its weather-beaten sides, so that at a distance it might readily be taken for one of the mesas common to the country. I suppose it was one of those strange buildings of a strange race called the Houses of Aztec. Lieutenant Buford with a party explored the ruin, climbing up by means of the trees and creepers that clung to the walls. The only entrance was through the roof of the highest story. It was full of small rooms opening into each other, and I should judge that the architect took his plan from a beehive. There was no signs of life about the place, and it was strange that the guerrillas did not occupy it for a stronghold, for nothing but heavy guns would breach its hill-like walls. But I suppose that some superstition kept them away. The following afternoon, we came to a mesa from the top of which a ranch could be seen, with horsemen around it not 3 miles off. Guerrillas at last. We charged on the place, raising our dragoon shout. My mount was good, though not equal to Lucifer, but I kept him well up to his work, taking the dirt from only Buford and 3 others. We overtook a lone greaser who made frantic efforts to escape, but was hurled from his Mustang, both rolling over and over, and no doubt breaking their necks. As we came close, we could see guerrillas driving cattle and horses from the corral through an archway into the ranch. Glazed hats appeared on the azotea, and we were fired on with muskets. The ranch was in the usual Mexican style, a square of buildings around a court, but in front of the central building, set back so that the corners projected like the bastions of a fort. There was only 2 windows on the front side, and these were placed in the walls at right angles with the front face, and defended with the reja, or iron grating. Built all of stone and cemented outside, it was a hard nut to crack without artillery. I noticed that the large doors of the gate opened inward, and I spoke of this to Buford, who caught at the idea. The men were dismounted, the horses sent to the rear under a guard, and a skirmish line thrown around the place to fire on the greasers on the roof, while 4 men picked up a heavy plow that lay on the ground and dashed at the gate, using this novel projectile as a battering ram. In spite of our covering fire, the salteadores shot down 2 of the 4. The other 2 dropped the ram and sought shelter under the walls. The Mexicans screamed triumphantly in their shrill, treble voices and kept up a fire on our 2 wounded who were trying to crawl out of danger. On seeing this cruel action, we all made a rush for the stronghold, picking up the plow and driving it with such force against the gate that it soon gave way. As it flew open, a carbine fire was poured in, and then a rush of shouts, cries of anguish, a fierce melee for 5 minutes, and the place was won. I had a narrow escape. I was looking for El Tuerto. I had no interest in any other. I wanted him all to myself. I passed a party of Mexicans desperately defending themselves in the patio against our men, and seeing that Viejo was not one of them, I dashed up the escalera, stairs to the roof, where I found myself attacked by a crowd of bravos. I was glancing among their faces for El Tuerto. Rather carelessly, I held my revolver in my left hand and my saber in my right, and not finding my man, tried to pass when one brutal-looking greaser cried out, "Americano Sony Bichi," and fired on me point blank with a huge flintlock pistol. Fortunately, he missed, but then lunged out with a machete while his companions closed on me. A shot from my Colts brought one down. Then there was a shout, and a dozen dragoons came pouring onto the roof, and I and my complimentary cuss were left to settle our own difficulty. I thought his black face was familiar and soon recognized. Antonio, the guide to General Wool, and the hero of the bedroom in our little affair at Paris. I was going to shoot, but the fool seemed to think he could pink me with his sword. So after a little play, I parried a thrust and gave a clean stroke to his bare neck. The steel cut through bone and gristle to the center, and the renegade guide fell with a curse on his lips, dead. The place was ours with the loss of 2 killed and 5 wounded. Of the robbers, 9 were dead, and the rest, 17, prisoners, many of them wounded. It was now after sundown. Our horses were brought in, and the wounded seen to, the gates closed and strongly fastened, and we went to work to make ourselves comfortable for the night. After supper, the prisoners were brought up and questioned by Buford as to the whereabouts of Canales, and myself as to El Tuerto. But to all inquiries, the sullen rascals only replied, "Quien sabe?" Manuel, the guide who had deserted our column just before the fight, was with them, and while Buford was cursing him, an accommodating ranger proffered his services to assist the rascal in shuffling off this mortal coil. So much kindness touched the lieutenant's heart, and he gently replied, "Yes, tape the damn son of a bee out and hang him." When the ranger, in the most delicate manner possible, went to place the noose around Manuel's neck, that the ungrateful renegade made a snap and caught the left hand of the friendly Texan in his teeth, biting it to the bone. The ranger tried to choke him off, but in vain, and fearing that he might lose his temper if the pain continued, drew his Bowie knife and drove it to the hilt in Manuel's heart. Then a most horrible scene ensued. All of the prisoners threw themselves on us with frightful yells. Many brandished knives that they had concealed, and inflicted some serious wounds before our men could rally. But it was soon over. When the brief but savage struggle ended, there was not one greaser left alive. In all of this I took no part. I had been holding a torch to light up the hanging, and acted as a candlestick until the tragedy was over. My principal emotion was disappointment and rage at not finding El Tuerto. That night, finding rest impossible, I got up and walked out into the courtyard. A full moon lit up the pile of ghastly corpses and turned their staring stony eyes to a horrid green. Our horses lay quietly resting, but the mustang and cattle, secured by lines of lassos at the farther end of the patio, were restless and uneasy from the smell of blood. By one of the fires, a group of dragoons were playing poker with money obtained from the slain salteadores. I watched the game a while and then visited our wounded. They appeared quite comfortable lying on piles of blankets with 2 men to attend to their wants. A kind-hearted ranger was sitting up and engaged in a game of euchre with 3 companions, with the same benign look that he wore when he volunteered to put a rope around the neck of Manuel. I went up to the azotea and joined the sentinel on post. The night was lovely. The moon shone bright and clear. Quiet reigned. The only noise came from the cattle and the dismal howls of coyotes who came close up to the wall scenting blood. When a corporal came up with a relief, I volunteered to stand until daylight. I don't know what kind of a watch I kept, but I know that my heart became as soft as a child's, and many tears were shed, and many a prayer was offered up from that lonely roof that night. And through all, there ran a hope that I might die and join my lost love. Chapter 33, Military Executions. 1. The death of Victor Galbraith. Victor Galbraith was a Prussian immigrant of a superior musical education who settled in Illinois and taught music for a living. On the call for volunteers by Governor Ford, he enlisted in Colonel Hardin's 1st Illinois Regiment. When his time expired, 12 months, he re-enlisted in a cavalry company organized from disbanded volunteers called the Buena Vista Guards. Captain Mears commanding. Galbraith was appointed bugler of the company, which encamped near the Buena Vista Ranch. Bugler Galbraith, like many soldiers, had a senorita living with him in camp. Returning unexpectedly one night from picket, he found some other man under his blankets. There was a row, of course, and Galbraith threatened to shoot the intruder, who proved to be his commander, the gallant Captain Mears. Poor Victor was dragged off to spend the night on the bare ground of the guard tent to reflect on the enormity of the crime of interfering with the pleasure of a commissioned officer. Captain Mears preferred charges against the unfortunate Prussian, who was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to be shot to death for threatening the life of his superior officer. The sentence was approved by General Taylor, and December 28, 1847 was the day fixed for the execution. Repeated efforts had been made to obtain a pardon, but in vain. The frail senorita traveled to Monterey, had an interview with General Wool, and begged for the life of her doomed lover. But the volunteers had been unruly of late, and an example had to be made. Galbraith must die. I had gone to Saltillo on an escort at the time, and with a companion rode out to Buena Vista on the morning of the execution. The troops were formed on the old wheat field, presenting 3 sides of a hollow square. In the open side, a grave was dug with the plain pine coffin beside it. Perfect silence prevailed in the ranks. All seemed deeply affected at the fate of the talented stranger, who was to die a dishonorable death in a strange land. The sound of muffled drums sent cold chills through everyone. When the sinister procession came in sight, a perceptible tremor ran through the ranks. My old acquaintance, Lieutenant Philip St. George Cook, as Provost Marshal, commanded the escort for a firing party. Victor Galbraith walked with a firm step. Dressed in his best, he looked soldierly and handsome. As he passed in front of the lines, his eyes seemed to seek out sympathy but appeared resigned. He was stationed beside the coffin, and the sentence of the court-martial, the order for execution, was read to him by Lieutenant Cook. The poor fellow looked around for the last time. The sun was rising over the mountain peaks east of Saltillo, flooding the valley with a soft golden light, and the sky was one grand mass of crimson and gold. Victor gave one look on all, then closing his eyes, and in the voice of the sweetest melody, he sang in German one of Luther's grand hymns, and said, "Goodbye, all, I am ready." His eyes were bandaged, 12 men moved up, the word of command was given, 12 muskets belched forth their contents. As the condemned fell back, a woman's scream was heard, and the senorita, who was the cause of all, rushed to him and raised his head into her lap. To the surprise of all, he was still alive and cried out, "Water, for God's sake, water." Lieutenant Cook gave him some from a canteen, then loaded up 2 of the muskets himself. After the guard tore away the shrieking poblana, the muskets were discharged close to the poor fellow's head, blowing it to atoms. Thus the military butchery of bugler Victor Galbraith was completed. 2. The hanging of the Legion of San Patricio. The Legion of St. Patrick was organized from the Irish deserters from our army. At one time, they numbered over 700 men, regular desperadoes, who fought with a rope around their necks. Their commander was the notorious Riley, a former sergeant in the 4th Infantry, now holding the commission of a colonel in the Mexican army. They fought like devils against us at Buena Vista, and at Contreras, the battalion held the convent and fortified walls of the hacienda 2 hours after the Mexicans had run away. Nearly 100 of the patricios were captured. They were tried by a court-martial, 50 sentenced to be hanged, the rest to dig the graves of their executed comrades, and to receive 200 lashes on the bare back, the letter D to be branded on the cheek with a red-hot iron, to wear an iron yoke weighing 8 pounds with 3 prongs, each 1 foot in length, around the neck, to be confined to hard labor, in charge of the guard during the time the army should remain in Mexico, then to have their heads shaved and be drummed out of camp. Riley, having deserted previous to actual hostilities, received the last sentence, served out his sentence, and married a wealthy Mexican lady, and lived respected by the greasers. One of those doomed to the halter 16 were hanged on the 9th of September, 1847, at the village of San Angel. On the following day, 4 were hanged at Mishcoak, and on the 13th, 30 more were strung up at the same place, 50 in all. The execution of the last number was attended with unusual and unwarranted acts of cruelty. The day selected was the one on which the fortress of Chapultepec was to be stormed, and the gallows was erected on a rising piece of ground just outside of the charming little village of Mishcoak, in full view of the attack on the castle. Colonel Harney, on account of the proficiency he had acquired as an executioner in hanging Seminoles in Florida, was selected to carry out the sentence. The man who had ravished young Indian girls at night and then strung them up to the limb of a live oak in the morning was certainly well fitted to carry out the barbarous order. To have the men placed under gallows with ropes around their necks, to remain until the American flag was displayed from the walls of Chapultepec, and then swing them off. A long beam supported by 4 uprights formed the gallows, from which dangled 30 lariats. As General Pillow's division moved forward to the assault, the patricios were brought out with their arms and legs tied, seated on boards laid across wagons, and faced to the rear. When 29 had been brought, the surgeon informed Harney that the other one was dying, having lost both legs at Contreras. Harney replied, "Bring the damned sons of B out. My order is to hang 30, and by GD, I'll do it." So the dying man was brought out and laid into a wagon and hauled to the gallows. When the order of execution was read to them, these reckless and desperate men, many of them wounded, made it the subject of mirth. One said, "If we won't be hung until your dirty old rag flies from the castle, we will live to eat the goose that will fatten on the grass that grows on your own grave, Colonel." Others cheered for old Bravo, the Mexican commander in the fortress. While the fight raged in the dense grove at the foot of Chapultepec, and the result seemed doubtful, they became more reserved. But when our troops appeared beyond the copse, driving the Mexicans up the hill, their levity returned. One said, "Colonel, oh, Colonel dear, will ye grant a favor to a dying man, one of the old second of Florida man, Colonel?" When Harney asked what he wanted, the Irishman replied, Thanks, Colonel. I knew ye had a kind heart. Please take my dudeen out of my pocket and light it by your elegant hair. That's all, Colonel." The red-headed colonel struck the jester a dastard blow on the mouth with his saber hilt, knocking some of his teeth out. As the poor wretch spit out blood, he cried out, "Bad luck to ye. Ye have spoilt my smoking entirely. I shan't be able to hold a pipe in my mouth as long as I live." The battle raged for hours with varying fortune before Chapultepec was won. When Harney saw our flag flung to the breeze from the highest tower of the castle, he gave the order for the wagons to start up, and 30 bodies hung whirling, swinging, kicking, and rubbing against each other in a fearful dance of death. Just as their legless comrade died, one of the desperadoes cried out, "Oh, ye old bricktop, it is kind ye are to make Murphy dance on nothing, now that he has lost his legs." Such was the miserable end of the infamous Legion of San Patricio. Chapter 34, The Horse Fort. Rumors of peace continued to reach us during the spring of 1848. The victories of General Scott's army seemed to confirm them, and we all expected to see the United States before long. We remained encamped at Walnut Springs with light duty and few drills. I had but partially recovered from the gloom of mind caused by the terrible fate of Carmelita and still kept a keen lookout for El Tuerto. In May 1848, I was detailed on a detachment that was ordered to go to Cerralvo to bring to Monterey one Miller, a former clerk to the English consul in Monterey. He was wanted at headquarters as a witness in an important smuggling case of contraband goods across the Rio Grande at Mir. The detachment consisted of 20 privates, one sergeant, two corporals, commanded by Lieutenant Campbell of the 2nd Dragoons. We reached Cerralvo without incident, received our man, and started back. On the second day of our return, March, June 4th, we passed through the little town of Marin at noon and were nearing the Agua Frio River when the two men on the advance fired on some horsemen in the road ahead and came back at a run. Lieutenant Campbell gave the order to draw saber and charge. We run on to a considerable column of guerrillas, cut right and left as we rode through and over them, then drew rein and rallied at some 300 yards. We had received no material damage. The road was full of dust that completely hid the ground, but the tooting of horns from the chaparral showed that they were in force. Campbell, with much gallantry but poor judgment, gave the order to charge back. Off we went at speed, past a confused mass of struggling men and horses, and had cleared the cloud of dust when fierce yells arose on all sides, and a scorching fire from escopettes was poured into our column with fatal effect. Down we went, man and horse. Lucifer gave a mighty leap and fell headlong dead. I sprang off in my time to save myself from being crushed, and throwing myself on the ground behind my poor dead companion, I lay low to avoid the fire. At first I thought I was alone, as the dust and smoke hid everything from sight, but as the cloud lifted, I saw that the road was full of my comrades. Lieutenant Campbell was on the ground a short distance behind me, holding his mare by the lariat. He sang out for us to get our horses together and take our carbines from the gun boots and secure our extra ammunition from the saddle pouches, form around him, and keep low. Some 12 of us had done so when the firing ceased, and the blowing of horns announced a charge. Campbell told us to keep cool, and only half of us to fire at a time, and that at the word of command. As we lay on the ground behind our live and dead horses, we could hear the orders given by the guerrillas, the clash of weapons, and the jingle of spurs as they formed up the road. Then came a fierce shout, a rushing sound, and 50 yards in our front, the bright lance points and the swarthy faces of the greasers shot out of the dust, coming down on us at speed. At the command, 6 carbines poured in their fire. Then, as they still came on, the other 6 and 2 Colt's revolvers told on them with such fatal precision that instead of riding us down as they easily could have done, they turned tail and went back faster than they came. We now went to work to strengthen our position. Men crawled out and collected all of the arms, carbines, pistols, escopettes, lances, and ammunition. Our wounded were collected, and lariats fastened to the dead horses, which were hauled into position by the live ones. Our loss was appalling. 5 lay quite dead, twice that number wounded, and no less than 15 of our horses were killed or wounded. One of the wounded men, a German by the name of Nottgen, volunteered to make an attempt to reach camp if the lieutenant would let him have his mare to ride. Campbell accepted the offer with joy when the mare was found to be wounded in the neck. Nottgen said he would risk her, and the wound being staunched, the brave fellow mounted and rode off just as the Mexicans reopened fire. As both ways the road was occupied by the guerrillas, Nottgen took to the chaparral on our left to try and flank them. We listened in anxiety for any sound announcing his discovery by the foe. A minute passed, then a distant yell, a shot, then another and another, told that our messenger was seen and fired on. Was he or his gallant steed hit? Soon a clear, ringing war whoop, the dragoon charging shout, rose high and clear above the coyote-like cries of the greasers. It was Nottgen's voice giving us the joyful news that he was past their lines, that he was safe. For no Mustang in Mexico could overtake the lieutenant's mare, a fast Kentucky thoroughbred. We answered with 3 genuine American hurrahs to let him know his signal was heard. We now felt in good spirits, for if we could hold out for 2 or 3 hours, he was safe. Everything that could be thought of was done to make our position stronger. The dead horses were arranged in a circle, a trench dug with our sabers on the inside, and the dirt and cactus plants piled against the dead bodies. On the outside, a circle of lassos and lariats was made fast to bushes some 3 feet from the ground, the lances planted over the breastwork, forming quite a formidable abatis, and all the firearms were loaded and placed ready at hand. Our wounded were seen to as far as possible. All but 4 could help in case of attack, and for a while we felt quite elated. In the meantime, the dust had settled and we obtained a view of the situation. We lay in a good position in the road, a clump of cactus and yuccas on each flank. Beyond was a clear space some 60 yards wide, and beyond this the chaparral was open and scattered, so that we could see for some distance. About 400 yards in front of us on the road towards Marin was a group of horsemen. Behind us on the road ran straight to the river, the banks of which we could see, with the blackened walls of the ruined ranch of San Francisco on the opposite side. On this road was posted another body of guerrillas, and horsemen could be seen riding through the chaparral on each side. We were surrounded. Puffs of dark smoke flew up from all points. The dull reports and the screech of the rough-cast copper bullets as they flew over and around us showed that the salteadores were trying the range. But now another enemy threatened us. Thirst. The fierce rays of a tropical sun beat down on us. Our blood was heated to a fever point. Our throats parched from the dust and powder. And this when we were so near the agua frio that we could hear the gurgle of its cool waters over its stony bed. We had in fact just emptied the warm water from our canteens when the fight commenced, in order to fill them at the river. The sufferings of our wounded was heartrending, their cries for water unceasing. The guerrillas had got our range, and their balls struck into our horse breastwork with an ominous thud that told us to lay low. A young and generous Irishman named Grady volunteered to go for water. Campbell remonstrated, but he would go. Armed with a saber and taking a dozen canteens, he secured a Mexican sombrero and serape, crawled through the chaparral to the open space, and without any judgment started on a run. He was soon shot down, and a horseman dashed out, lassoed him, and dragged him into the chaparral to be butchered at their leisure. If it was not for our wounded, we would have charged down the road, gained the river, or died in the attempt. But no one thought of leaving our disabled comrades. The increased cries of the brigands and much galloping to and fro made our hearts beat with renewed hopes of succor. A cloud of dust on the Salinas road showed that something was approaching. Friends or foes was the question. Oh, that it might prove to be Mustang Gray, Old Reed, Bailey, or some other ranger in his command. But how our hearts fell when we were convinced that it was a reinforcement to our enemies. A band of at least 50 horsemen came in sight and formed line in the open space, showing considerable drill and discipline. They held counsel with our foes, and there was much gesticulating and pointing towards our position. A couple of burros were brought to the front, with something lashed on their pack saddles. We wondered what new devilment was about to take place. We had not long to wait to solve the mystery. The burros were wheeled round, bringing their rear towards us, with lassos hauled taut from each leg. A dashing-looking guerrilla dismounted and aimed something towards us. A port fire was applied, and a pound ball plumped into the road and ricocheted over our heads. The other was fired and overshot. Jackass artillery. We had heard of them, but never seen the article. While they had no effect on us, the result with them was quite serious. The recoil kicked over both of the gun carriages as the burros were thrown down. One was disabled by having a leg broke. A gallant caballero now rode towards us, whom I recognized as my quondam acquaintance, Padre Martí Martínez, the guerrilla chief. Without orders, 4 of the men fired on him, and Marty fell to the ground, his faithful, well-trained Mustang remaining with him. The wounded chief reached up and took the lasso from the pommel of the saddle and fastened it under his arms, when the intelligent animal dragged him slowly from the field. The enemy now opened a furious fire with escopettes, and the jackass guns gave out their sullen roar. At a bugle call, the firing ceased, and from 3 sides came the rush of charging squadrons. We expected death, but resolved to die like wolves, to rend and kill to the last. We poured in a volley with the captured escopetas, then with carbines, and as we had 4 or 5 loaded firearms each, our fire was incessant, even our worst wounded loaded for us. Lances gleamed through the dust and smoke. Fierce cries of matar los Americanos ladrones sounded on all sides. Their horses ran against the ropes and fell, while our fire told fearfully on the struggling mass. The brigands again retreated in confusion into the chaparral, leaving more than 20 dead greasers on the ground. Wounded horses stood by their dead riders, and many lay by the ropes. That proved our salvation. We collected more arms, and oh joy, found 3 of the double-headed gourds that the Mexicans carry, full of water. This was sparingly dealt out to all, and gave us much benefit. All arms were carefully loaded. Mustangs added to our breastwork, and the Mexican serapes brought in, and though again under a heavy fire, we felt we could hold all day. One of the wounded suddenly said, "Hark, I hear our squadron coming." Lying flat on the ground, we could hear a faint but distinct rumbling noise away across the Agua Frio, and soon could make out the roar of iron-shod horses coming on the road from Monterey at speed. Saved. We fired as fast as we could to drown the noise of their approach from the guerrillas, but the splash of water at the river crossing gave the alarm, and all that was living disappeared in the chaparral. The dragoons came up the road with such fearful speed that we were in danger of being run over. We sprang onto our breastwork and tried to cheer as the head of the column divided, and 200 bold dragoons dashed by on the right and the left of us. One company remained by us, the surgeons, hospital stewards, and ambulances came up. All were put into the ambulances, dead, wounded, and unhurt, and carried to the Agua Frio. Our appearance was distressing. Our clothes were saturated with blood and sweat, and covered with dust, faces begrimed with powder. The ambulances stopped in the shade of some alamo trees on the riverbank, and all were stripped and washed. The dead, wrapped in blankets, were tenderly loaded in a wagon. The wounded received treatment. Those of us who were unhurt took a bath in the river, ate a hearty supper, and then being supplied with some hospital brandy, got jolly drunk, and went into the ambulances to camp in that condition. Our loss was 7 killed, 12 wounded, and 17 horses killed, and all of the rest so badly wounded as to be unserviceable. These were shot. Of the Mexicans, 29 lay dead as they fell, and 2 wagon loads of saddles and arms were collected and brought to camp. The dragoons returned the next day with 22 prisoners, some of them wounded. They were examined before General Wool, and a crowd of alcaldes, padres, and curas came forward and testified that they were all honest rancheros on their peaceful way to a festival at Salinas when attacked by us, and they only defended themselves. They stated also that peace had been made 3 weeks before. The prisoners made the same statement and said that the good father, Martí Martínez, lost his life as he went to tell us that we might go in safety to camp. The innocent chaparral rangers were released and suffered to go in safety. But as it happened, there was many dragoons and rangers out on all the roads and trails through the chaparral a-hunting that day. And as game was scarce and not wishing to return with empty game bags, it unfortunately happened that the released innocents met the hunters and were bagged, and this not 500 yards from camp. Every one of them was shot, with the new alcalde of San Nicolas. This was the last guerrilla fight of the war. Chapter 35, Friends and Fireworks. It was not until the middle of June that we received official notice that the Treaty of Peace between the United States and Mexico had been signed at Guadalupe, May 30th, 1848. Cheer after cheer went up from the volunteer camps. Hurrah for New Orleans, for the United States and home. All of them were in high glee. But for the regulars, the real Uncle Sam's boys, peace made but little difference. They had to serve out their time out, peace or war. I myself was enlisted only for the war, but on the advice of Major Rucker, decided to stay with my squadron, guarding the enormous quantities of ordnance in quartermaster stores in Monterey until they could be collected and shipped out of the country. I was satisfied, for I liked Mexico, and had a serious notion to remain in the country, turn Salteadore, hunt down El Tuerto, and avenge Carmelita, and then marry some Senorita Rica, rich lady, and return to Boston as Don Juan Peloncillo and rejoin the church. But fate, fortune, or providence ordained otherwise. As the last wagon started from our camp at Walnut Springs, we bid adios to the weeping senoritas of San Nicolas and started down the Camargo Road, accompanied by hundreds of our fair friends. Some were mounted on Mustangs, some on burros, but most on foot, all striving to get out of the country, to escape the most horrible outrages by the greasers, who seemed resolved to kill all the Yankee doos, as the women were called, who had lived with the Americans. The next morning, we had just reached the Grand Plaza of Marin when a courier came at a jump and handed Major Rucker a letter. It was an order for the dragoons to report back to Monterey to refit for a journey to California, to us then a terra incognita. Some of the dragoons deserted before we reached our old camping ground, and most were dissatisfied. But I was rejoiced. It promised adventures, some new scenes, and I resolved to go if I had to re-enlist. We went into our old camp, much to the joy of the Yanquitos of San Nicolas. During the war, many of the females of the country had proved firm friends of Los Gringos, and we were often indebted to them for valuable information regarding the movements of the enemy, their own countrymen. Our fair female friends showed the utmost contempt for the weak, dissolute greasers, and were public in their outspoken admiration of the stalwart frames, fair skins, blue eyes, and the kind and courteous demeanor of Los Barbarianos del Norte. This feeling was not confined to the lower classes. The señoritas ricas and the doñas puros castellanas of the towns shared it with the poblanas and margaritas of the villages. As might be supposed, this did not increase the love of the hombres for us, or render the position of the Yanquitos, now that their protectors were leaving the country, a pleasant one. They suffered fearful outrages from the returned Mexican soldiery. And the ladrones of the country, they were violated, ears cut off, branded with the letters US, and in some cases impaled by the cowardly greasers, who thus wreaked their own vengeance on the defenseless women. At Saltillo, there were a number of women who had lived with the Americans and were models of their class. When our troops evacuated the town, these unfortunates were compelled to remain behind, some of them ladies of unusual beauty. After General Lombardini's Mexican division reoccupied the place, the authorities got up a grand celebration to commemorate the Treaty of Peace. At midnight, the Grand Plaza was all ablaze with fireworks and full of drunken soldiers, pollos, and ladrones, when a fat Dominican monk, one Padre Olitze, got up on the fountain in the center of the square and in the most fiery language denounced these poor Yanquitos to the mob. With yells of fiends, they searched out the miserable creatures, dragged them from their beds and their nightclothes to the plaza, where for hours they were subjected to nameless horrors. An unheard of atrocity was perpetrated on them by the agency of the less brutal burros. And then, in their dying agonies, they had their ears cut off, and the finishing stroke, a merciful one, given by cutting their throats. 23 women were tortured to death at this time, and no notice was taken of it by General Lombardini or anyone else among the Mexican authorities. Okay, thanks for listening.